Greetings Internet viewers, and welcome to the video. Today we're going to be celebrating G.I. Joe's 60th birthday. First of all, let's start off with addressing why it is that I care about this subject to begin with. And for that we've got to travel back to the far-off decade of the 1990s. I know, it hurts me too thinking about that. It was over 30 years ago. It was going on 30 years ago. Back then, I was just a little guy, and I was watching some TV with my mother. We happened to be watching Antiques Roadshow at the time, and someone randomly had brought on their G.I. Joe figure to get appraised. And for some reason, seeing that toy on the TV made me want one of these little dorks. The weird thing is that I didn't want to start collecting these toys right away because I knew that I would ruin them if I got my hands on them while I was still a kid. For some reason, that was just my thought process at the time. So it wasn't until the later portion of the 90s, sometime in 1998 or 1999, that I got my first G.I. Joe figure, but he was one of the 90s Joes, not like these figures we're talking about today. Now then, let's fast forward to the present, some 20 plus years later, and learn a little something about this guy. In terms of the actual birth date of America's movable fighting man here, there's been a bit of speculation about which date should be considered as Joe's official birthday. Some people go with the date that the patent for these figures went into effect, which was February 2nd in 1964, but there are also others who feel that the date that these toys were introduced at the New York Toy Fair, which was March 9th of that same year, should be the date. He was created by the creative team at Hasbro, yes, that same Hasbro that's currently in some hot water for some shady business practices, only back then they were referred to as Hassenfield Brothers. And it was at that point in time, 60 years ago, this year exactly, that the action figure was born. You see, back then it was very taboo for boys to play with dolls. And let's face it, these original G.I. Joe figures were put together in a fairly doll-like fashion. And in order to get around that, the whole doll thing, the people behind the project decided that they should never, and I mean never, call G.I. Joe a doll. Instead, a person working on the team came up with the term posable action figure. Then throughout the years, that was shortened to the phrase we commonly use today, just action figure. When he was first introduced, there were only 4 different action figures to collect in the G.I. Joe line, one representing each of the 4 different armed forces of the United States. Those figures included the G.I. Joe Action Soldier, the G.I. Joe Action Sailor, the G.I. Joe Action Pilot, and the G.I. Joe Action Marine. Each one came packaged in a box fairly similar to this one, only obviously this is from later in the G.I. Joe brand when they had switched over to the Adventure Team era. And this box isn't even an original Adventure Team box. This is from 2006, when they did a reissue of the original figures from the Adventure Team era. But anyway, inside those cardboard boxes, you would get the G.I. Joe figure himself, complete with his uniform. He came with a pair of boots, molded in either brown plastic, like these ones, or black plastic, like his over here. He came with a metal dog tag with the name G.I. Joe stamped into the metal. And he also came with insignia, which were basically just little stickers you could use to decorate his uniform. Unfortunately, none of mine have any of the insignia left, but you can see where they were, like this weirdly shaped dark spot right here, and you can just about make out on this shoulder where there was one over here. And one other thing that came with each figure in those boxes were their field manuals. One, of course, representing each of the different armed forces, and obviously here we have the Army manual for our little Army soldier. Any and all other accessories for these little dudes, like what I've got in this big box right here, had to be purchased separately due to a marketing strategy that Hasbro was borrowing from what razor companies were doing at the time, and technically they're still doing to this day, which was to sell the razors and the handles separately to maximize profits. So let's say you get, like, Action Soldier here for Christmas, but you don't get anything else to go with him. You'd have to either get real creative real quick to keep the adventure going, or you'd have to have someone buy you some of the accessory sets to, like, say, turn Joe into a medic, or, like, say, take him on a deep-sea diving adventure. So, honestly, I gotta say that was kind of genius, but at the same time, pretty sneaky there, Hassenfield brothers. Sometime during the original run of Joe's, someone at the company came up with an idea so genius, so innovative, that it was copied by other toy companies for decades to follow after that. The storage case, or as it was originally referred to back then, the footlocker. Much like what would come later down the road, it had a storage compartment down in the bottom for at least one of your G.I. Joe figures, along with a bunch of his accessories. It also came with a tray where you could store more of Joe's accessories in each of these individual little compartments, and it also has a sticker in the top, a decal if you will, to show where to put everything, like his boots, his helmet, his guns, his ammo pouches, and all that kind of nonsense. Now, another thing to note here is that in order to keep people interested in these toys, every couple of years or so, Hasbro would have to come up with a new innovation, a new gimmick, to keep Joe fresh in the eyes of the consumer public. And the first of these innovations, to my knowledge, was giving Joe the ability to speak. You heard that right. In 1967, as I already stated, they put a talking mechanism in Joe that was not too unlike what you would find in, say, a figure like Beetlejuice here. His dog tags were attached to a string, and you would pull that string out of his chest to make him say one of 8 different phrases. Unlike Beetlejuice, however, with the G.I. Joes at that point in time, and leading up until the Adventure Team era with the Talking Commander, there were little blue and red lines toward the end of the string that you could stop at certain points to choose what Joe would say. Like, for example, a red line could make Joe say, "Medic, get that stretcher up here," whereas another one could make him say, "Cover me, I'll get that machine gun." I actually have one of these figures. He's got the wrong head for some reason, so he looks like a talking Adventure Team commander. But, like I was saying, see, there's the, if I can get this open, there's the chain for his dog tag, which is unfortunately missing. And you'd pull this out, like so. And they're a bit faded, but you can like just about make out the red and blue lines right there. And when you let go of the string, that was G.I. Joe, U.S. Army, reporting for duty. Then you pull it out to a different length, and if I pull it far enough, that was take the Jeep and get some ammo. Fast. Hopefully the microphone's picking it up. Let's go for one more, and then we'll move on to the next part. Let me try that one more time. That was just the first phrase again. Anyway, you get the idea. The next innovation Hasbro came up with, which I just kind of showed you with that guy there, was to give Joe what they referred to as lifelike hair, which is essentially they just glued a whole bunch of little fibers to the top of his head using a technique known as flocking. And I'll say this much, the hats stay on a heck of a lot better with the flocking than they do without. Case in point. See? After that came the Kung Fu gripping hands, which were just rubber hands molded in more of a gripping position, as opposed to the original plastic hands with their weirdly posed fingers and that backwards thumbnail that Hasbro used in accompaniment with the scar on Joe's cheek there in order to help copyright the little fella. Then came the eagle eyes, which allowed you to be able to make Joe look left or right using a little lever on the back of his head. Now, I don't presently have a G.I. Joe with the eagle eyes, so here's his cousin from Great Britain known as Action Man, who has the exact same head sculpt, so he's going to demonstrate for us. Ready? Go. With just a simple push of the lever, you could make his eyes move. He is looking at you, kid. And one of the last changes they made to this particular version of G.I. Joe was to give him more of a muscular physique. Unfortunately, I don't currently have one of those particular figures. I do have an Action Man with that similar physique, so here he is again to stand in for that. Essentially, the main reason is because with the G.I. Joes, with the whole muscle body thing going on, because of the way that they were put together, essentially in place of having like these kind of ball and socket joints, Hasbro thought it would be a fantastic idea to just use essentially big chunks of rubber to hold the arms together and hold them onto the body. And if you know anything about the G.I. Joes, especially the ones with kung fu gripping hands, well know that over time rubber tends to harden, or perish as they like to call it. So once that rubber went off, as I like to call it, the arms and head just broke off from the body, and now you have to actually put in effort to get yourself a muscle-bodied G.I. Joe and restring him and all that good nonsense. But with the Palitoy Action Man here, as I already mentioned, they've got these ball and socket joints that actually hold everything together nice and neatly. The only thing that they did wrong, well, they didn't do something wrong. To kind of cut corners, they used rubber to hold the heads on for these guys. So with the one I've got here, someone back in the day actually went ahead and replaced the initial piece of rubber that rotted away in there with like a little piece of elastic cord, so the head stays on and all that, but now you can do fancy things like this. But anyway, from the 1960s to the 1970s, to early 70s I should say, go ahead and cover his modesty, even though there's nothing there. This is what Joe looked like without his uniform on. So that's the 60s Joe. Again, cover his modesty over here. There's the 70s Joe, the exact same body. It wasn't until that point in the later 70s that Hasbro was like, he kind of looks like a robot. Let's fix that. And then they came up with the muscle-bodied idea. Which, honestly, I think that was a good improvement. But, like I said, the way that they constructed that guy using those rubber parts, not a smart move on your part there, Hassenfield Brothers. But that was then, and this is now. Anyway, after this, in 1978, in a last-ditch effort to keep Joe going, Hasbro decided that they drastically needed to cut costs even further, so they decided that for the first time in 14 years, between 1964 and 1978, that they were going to shrink him down. Because originally, G.I. Joe was about 12 inches, or 30.48 centimeters in size. But to make him more competitive with Mego and their world's greatest superhero line of figures and toys, they shrank Joe down to about an 8-inch scale, or 20.32 centimeters, and renamed him Super Joe. After that, Hasbro stopped making new G.I. Joe toys until around 1982, when they came out with their best-selling and most wildly popular series yet, A Real American Hero, which were a line of 3 3/4 inch or 9.525 centimeter action figures, and they were given this scale to compete with Kenner's Star Wars figures. And this series of figures is still going to this day in one form or another. With all of that said, I would just like to thank each and every single one of you guys out there watching this presently. I do truly and greatly appreciate it. Also, this video has been a labor of love, and I really hope that that's shown here today. I truly mean that. And if you like my content, or you like what you've seen here today, please feel free to leave a like, and maybe even comment down below if you'd like to see more content of this kind in the future. Also, if you want to keep up to date with my content, then please feel free to go ahead and click on that subscribe button. And if you'd like to help out the channel, then please feel free to go on over to patreon.com/Oxleymations and get signed up for that. There's not a whole lot there presently, but trust me, I've got stuff planned. On that note, I'll see you all in the next video. Later, everyone.